All right, now let's look at the structure of skeletal muscle and kind of how it's put together. Don't worry too much about, there's a bunch of terms here. There's a few that I'm going to point out you do need to worry about, but there's a bunch of others that, like I said, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, whether it's whether because you're interested in medicine or maybe sports performance or something like that, feel free to dive into this or ask questions, but we'll just cover the basics of what you need to know for here. So this is a picture that shows, and this is in your notes, of a cutaway of like one of the quadriceps muscles. So you can see over on the side there's a tendon that attaches the bone to the muscle. And anytime muscle attaches to bone, it's with a tendon. You should know that term. If it's bone to bone, it's a ligament. Bone to muscle is a tendon. So then you can see the body of the muscle, and there's these kind of like bunches or bundles that make up the muscle itself. And then when you get farther over here, you'll see that each of those bundles has smaller bundles. And then that bundle has some other small bundles with, and this is a term you should know right here, this sarcoplasmic reticulum. Make sure you know that one. We're going to come back to that. And it's surrounding and kind of coating this smaller group of muscle fibers that are all arranged together. Now, let me move myself out of the way here, though. The next one is there's myofibrils. And these myofilaments are going to be really important. There's two myofilaments that we'll talk about on the next page, and they are actin and myosin. The myosin is the red one there, and at least on my picture, I guess in yours it's not color most likely, but it's the thicker one in the middle. And the thinner ones on the outside, the blue there, are the actin. So this right here is myosin, and these four right here, those are actin. All right. Now, like I said, don't worry too much about that. You're going to need to know actin. You're going to need to know myosin. You're going to need to know sarcoplasmic reticulum. But everything else there is to just show that muscles kind of arranged in these bundles of, like a big bundle of smaller bundles of really small bundles with little tiny fibers inside of that. And you'll notice that the next time you eat like roast beef or chicken or anything like that, you can pull it apart. You can actually pull these little bundles of muscle fiber apart when you're eating like most meat. It comes apart in those kind of bundles just like this, with a little bit of fat and other things and muscle tissue and blood vessels all in there to support everything, but that's their arrangement, especially skeletal muscle. Now, the reason that the muscle is striated, remember that cardiac and skeletal muscle are striated or striped. And the reason they're striped is because of the actin and myosin, those little tiny filaments. So here, the myosin is this kind of thicker red filament in the middle, and these little thin lines right here, those are the actin. So when muscle contracts, this up above is a muscle that's relaxed. You can see that the myosin is there in the center, and the actin is kind of out to the sides. Well, when that muscle is told to contract, imagine the myosin is basically like a tug of war, where it starts to pull from this side, but it also starts to pull from this side. And you can see the actin, what they're calling this Z line here, where the actin faces out from. But you'll see that those get pulled closer together. In this picture, they're much closer together. So every one of those units gets a little bit smaller, and it probably shortens only by like a nanometer, which is microscopic. But when you think of every single stripe in that striated muscle is one of these units, and if every one of those units shrinks by even just 1 nanometer, that muscle can contract quite a bit. So it's the myosin pulling on the actin from both sides that causes the muscle to contract. And we call that, you should maybe underline this, I'm on page 3 now. If you look down at D, it's called the sliding filament model of muscle contraction. And up above that, back to B, I'm kind of going out of order though, these are the two filaments that are there. So the actin filament, that's the thin one that's getting pulled on, is made of these kind of like little beads in the outside part. And the myosin is a thicker, kind of a more rope-like fiber. And it's got these, like look at the one on top here, this kind of braided thing with a head on the end. And a whole bunch of those together makes that thick myosin filament. And each of those heads is grabbing and pulling on the actin, and that's what causes the muscle to contract. This whole thing, I should point out, this is a word you should maybe know. Is this in your notes? It might be in there somewhere. If it isn't, you might want to just write this in. I don't see it. I would just write this in somewhere, that this whole thing together is called a sarcomere. So in the sliding filament model of contraction, the sarcomere, which is this whole thing we're looking at right here, gets shorter. And as the sarcomeres, all of the sarcomeres get shorter, the muscle contracts. So maybe not a huge deal, but I would know that term. Okay, all right. So that's why muscle is striated, is because of all of these guys together. Now, let's look at how the contraction actually happens if we zoom in. So in your notes then, we're going to be going through, starting on page 4. Let's see, maybe not. Yeah, let's go to page 4. So you got this diagram on page 4 in your notes. We'll just follow along here. So the first thing happens is whenever myosin can, and it can't always, we'll talk about that in a second, but whenever myosin can, it grabs onto actin. So if this is the thin actin filament, that myosin head, whenever it can, will grab it and it will pull any chance that it gets. So A here, the myosin head attaches to the actin, and then it pulls. Now in the second diagram above here, that dotted line is showing where it used to be. So the dotted line is where the myosin attached, and then you can see it pulled, and the actin filament got pulled across towards the myosin, and that's going to cause that shortening. So that's how it happens. Myosin grabs, myosin pulls. The next step is the myosin head then has to release and reset. And oddly enough, that's what takes the ATP. It's not the pull of the muscle that uses energy, it's the let go and reset that uses the ATP. Now you can think of the myosin like a spring, right? Like we're loading the mousetrap, and then as soon as the mousetrap gets triggered, it just releases. But it's the release and the reset that actually uses the ATP here. So you can see now the myosin head on that far diagram C has released, and it's reset back to its original position, and now it's going to wait for the next time that it can grab. And if you're still telling your muscle to contract, it'll grab again and pull, and it will just keep grabbing and pulling over and over and over again, and that sarcomere will continue to get shorter as long as your brain is still sending a signal to the muscle to tell it to contract. So the whole sequence, that's how it works. Signal goes from the brain, it gets down to the muscle, tells that myosin head to start going. But remember, the myosin wants to do this all the time. Like it's not waiting for a signal. It's just if it can grab actin and pull, it will. So the control actually comes from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So this is number 6 in your notes. Pardon me. So you can see in the picture on the left here that the actin, the little beads at the bottom there, are blocked, right? There's that blue kind of a something in the way blocking those there's little yellow active sites. Those are where the myosin can grab onto. All those attachment points are blocked. So myosin right now can't grab the actin. And that blue rope is called troponin. Now, attached to the troponin, or sorry, this is the tropomyosin. Attached to the tropomyosin is the troponin, those little kind of blue heart-looking things that are on there. Those are little calcium receptors. So when your body wants to contract a muscle, the signal goes from your brain, down through your nervous system, through your spinal cord, out to wherever that muscle might be. And it stimulates the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is storing calcium. And when you stimulate that storage, it releases the calcium just kind of out. And since, remember, it's sitting right on those muscle fibers, it's basically just bathing the muscle fibers in a calcium solution. And as soon as calcium binds, like up here, to the troponin, it moves the tropomyosin off of that active site. So if this is, let's say this is the active site on the actin right here, that tropomyosin is sitting there blocking it so the myosin head can't get it. As soon as troponin has calcium, that moves out of the way. And now if there were a myosin head here, it could grab that site now and pull to cause the muscle to get shorter. So that's the control mechanism, is calcium. And that's why sometimes if people are calcium deficient, it can cause problems in your muscles, not just skeletal muscles, but even in your heart. Your cardiac muscle doesn't work properly if you don't have calcium. And which is also why your body, because your heart and your muscles are so important, will actually steal calcium from your bones if your diet isn't very good in calcium, because you can handle your bones getting a little bit weak. If your heart stops beating, you die. So it'll actually pillage from your bones if you don't have a good diet high in calcium. Right? So go through your notes. That's got kind of all the points there of how this muscle contraction works. And if you have any questions, there's a lot of new terms there like sarcomeres and sarcoplasmic reticulums and troponin and tropomyosin and actin and myosin and all that stuff. There's just a lot of terminology there. If there's anything there that doesn't make sense, make sure you ask. But hopefully now you can kind of see and put this together. All of these little sarcomeres getting shorter is what causes the muscle to contract. And you using all your muscles together is what makes you move. So if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, see you on the next one.